So there's two things that I'm going to want to talk about with you guys today. The first is, and I'm hoping I can fit both of these in. The first is going to be to talk about our Collins reading, because especially at the very beginning of a book, it's really important to kind of get a grasp of what's going on. Because at the beginning is sort of where you set up all the problems and things that you're going to talk about, the perspectives you're going to use in your book, usually. And then I'd like to get us to at least start sharing our topics and talking about them, or at least what you're thinking about doing. So I'd like to start doing that as well. And I like to do that as a group so we can kind of do it collaboratively. Well, I'm teaching BC Experience for the first time. This is like one of the things that starts out at the very beginning is like, learning is collaborative, right? Which is really, really quite true. And if you've had other classes with me, I say this a lot, like, often we think of writing as a lonely activity, right? And we're kind of trained into that in undergrad, but like, in reality, very little of what gets written is ever like one person's voice. And if you like decided, for those of you who are grad school bound, like if you decided to, if you go to grad school, you're going to find that like what you end up writing is going to be as much your advisor, it's going to be as much other people around you, right? And those checks is actually part of how we get better information, right? That's actually what the whole peer review process is about. When did I mention in here that I have an article coming out right now? So I just got accepted, another article accepted. This one's on a South African rap group named Dionverg. Anyways, when you go through that process, other people read it and they send you massive amounts of notes and you have to implement them, right? But that's actually what peer review means, right? That's why it's higher quality, is essentially of other people being like, whoa, you can't say that, right? That's not true, or whatever, right? Or you're missing this, right? And so like that's actually part of that process. That's why we treat them as better sources. Anyways, so getting back to it, the idea is like, if we share our topics and we all kind of talk about it, so the idea will be that you guys can share thoughts, directions, things you read in other classes that you think might be helpful, whatever, right? Perspectives you vaguely have heard of, like whatever comes to mind when people are talking, or things that ways they could narrow it or make it more interesting, right? Things they could do that's related to it, like any of those suggestions coming from any of us will improve all of our papers in the end. So I like to have us collaboratively share, even though it's a little bit of a time suck in some ways, and we'll probably have to kick some of it till Tuesday. Okay, getting back to the Collins. How many people have ever read this is the term that we use for this is monograph, right? It's a book where it's written by one author. How many people have ever read a nonfiction monograph like this, where it's one solid book written by one author? Any of you guys read this kind of nonfiction work before? It is a huge chunk of what usually gets written and talked about. In fact, like usually in your, when you like read journal articles for writing a paper, and they like are talking about these like major figures that it seems like they're really important to understanding the phenomenon, most of that stuff's written in monograph form, not in journal article form. So it's a great thing to learn how to access information-wise. They usually have a pretty set format to them. Insofar as like, they start out with a chapter that's going to be like their overarching explanation, and then from there they're just going to dig into more detail, or talk about related cases, or do empirical examples of what it is, what they're talking about, close readings of something, anything like that, right, in between. And then in the conclusion, they'll tie everything together again, right, and pull all that new information back together. So that's generally how they're set up, often with several empirical chapters in between. So I like to, in most classes, at least most topical classes, have one book that we read, a standalone book. So for this class I chose Collins' Black Feminist Thought. This is arguably, at least when it comes to US racial theory, maybe the most important book written in the last 25 years. So it's a pretty important book within the context of theories about race coming out of the United States. So I actually had a chance to meet Patricia Hill Collins once. I used to be a conference planner for a long time for the ISTC, so I actually got to meet quite a few famous scholars. Usually they're jerks, just to be frank, right? Patricia Hill Collins is really nice, which is kind of interesting because her rhetoric is pretty strong, right? But then you meet her interpersonally, and we just talked about like pets and her kids and stuff. Because you don't talk about scholarly things if somebody's about to go present, right? You just don't do that because you don't want to like screw them up or get them thinking about other things, so that, right? So you just like make small talk. Like you pick them up from the airport and you make small talk, Patricia Hill Collins is probably one of the nicest academics I've ever met. Anyways, that's just sort of an aside. Okay. So, any of your guys' thoughts or reactions on this book before I think we should probably go through this section bit by bit. I'd like to collect your guys' experiences, if you have something you want to share. Or things you got out of it that you thought were really interesting, or questions you had about it. You guys want a few minutes to look back over it? Would that be helpful for you guys? Yes, no. I know it's 8 in the morning, guys. Yeah.
I just thought it was interesting how she, when she talked about suppression, she even talked suppression in the own feminist movement, and how a lot of U.S. white feminists have resisted black feminism in a lot of ways, which I really never seen before. So I thought that was pretty interesting to read.
Yeah, that's a big part of what she does is so both in the Black Civil Rights Movement and in part of her argument and in white feminism, what she calls white feminism, there is currents of it that sort of keep voices, particularly other minority voices, from being heard. Yeah. We'll look at that definitely in more detail. Other things people got out of it. Let's go ahead and start at the beginning then. Okay, so chapter 1, what does she start with? Who does she start talking about at the very beginning?
She starts talking about Maria Stewart.
Yeah, Maria Stewart. So what's the significance of Maria Stewart here? What's the significance for Collins? Who is Maria Stewart? From what you gathered. She's calling her a black feminist thinker.
She was the first woman to lecture in the public on political issues and have her text copied down.
Yeah. Yeah. So she's one of the first people one of the first black women to be recorded talking about political issues. What else is significant about her?
She was an orphan.
What's that?
She was an orphan.
She's an orphan. Right. She's in the slavery system. At one time. Would most people categorize Maria Stewart as a great thinker in his world history? Are you likely to come across whole classes where you slowly read Maria Stewart's canon? Dig into the depths of what she's saying. No, she's pretty, so she's starting with something really obscure. Probably none of her readers have ever heard of this person, right? So she's starting with that. And there's a point that she's making here about black women's voices historically. What is that? What's the point here?
But they haven't really been paid attention
Yeah, that there are black women's voices pop up occasionally, Sojourner Truth, Maria Stewart, right? But these figures often, what they wrote, what they said, like we get little snippets here or there, but by and large, like, there's not much, right? And why is that? So that's kind of our first question that she's kind of looking at. Why is it that if we're taking historical representations of voices, who is it that gets heard? So first of all, who has written or had most of their thoughts and claims recorded historically as a group?
White men.
Yeah, white men, right? Like, white men because of their privileged position within the system. Even today, like, if you were to stack most of the publications made, most of them are made by white men, right? Most of the department chairs in the universities are white men. Most of your college presidents and deans are white men, right? Most of your politicians are white men. Most of your, right? So, like, if you're thinking about within, like, whose voice gets heard, right? Predominantly, white men's voices get heard, right? Whose voices after white men do you think you're likely to hear?
Like white women, maybe?
White women, right? So, like, this is actually, like, we're going to get into, and this is kind of part of the point that you were making, we're going to get into something called intersectionality. And this is probably the thing that Collins is most known for. And by intersectionality, we mean that we try to understand domination and oppression via one characteristic. At a time. Right? So we try to understand and change. Try to understand and change oppression through one form of difference at a time. So you think about political movements, right? Like, often, like, political movements have been, like, in defense of women, in defense of minorities, in defense of homosexuals, in defense of, right? And there's one category at a time, right? What Collins wants to claim is that that doesn't really, in a lot of ways, get to the people who are at the most risk. Because domination doesn't happen through these individual categories, it happens through what she calls the matrix of domination. The matrix of domination. And by the matrix of domination, she means that within an individual category, people are not equally privileged. So within the category of women as a group of people, not everybody has an equal privileged position. Right? Within the category in her book of being black, right? That's the example of minority that she uses the most, right? There, people are not in equal positions, right? But instead, like, their domination happens on multiple lines. So we all sit in a position of being both privileged and unprivileged all at once. Some of us are more privileged than others. So in the matrix of domination, everyone everybody is both privileged and not. Everyone is not equally privileged. So how does that work? How might that work? Let's think about this practically. What do we see differences within people? Within a given group that we normally think of as oppressed.
Well, like everyone comes from like a different family, so like your family could have like, you know, middle class, or could be like not have that much money, and like even if you're like, you know, like if you're white, you know, like some people are middle class, but other people could be like, you know, more poor or something like that.
Yeah, so within, so like people often have different socioeconomic statuses, right? The experience in this, so the experience of being a woman, right, as somebody who's underprivileged through their gender, is not the same for poor women as it is for wealthy women, right? They see a different slice of reality, right? And it's very different being a poor minority versus a wealthy minority. Right? So it's at that, so to understand what's happening, we have to understand, for any given population, we're talking about what is the intersection, right, that they're at between these categories. How do they fit in with this matrix of domination? We can't just have one form of difference. Okay. So we're going to think about one, like real forms of oppression, and then two, we're going to think specifically, well, real's not a, we're going to think about everyday forms of oppression, and then we're going to talk about forms of oppression specifically in terms of having a voice. So forms of oppression in terms of access to things like the discourse on like, you know, on inequality. Okay. Does anybody pick up on this inside or out stuff? Let me see. Well, which versions of this text do people have? I'm gonna hold it up. I'm just curious what most people ended up buying. Most people have the same one as me. So I'm going to holler out page numbers. If you didn't bring your book to class, try to do it and from now on. So this inside or out stuff picks up on page like 14 and 15, or outside or within. Actually, sorry, I gave you the wrong page number, 13. It starts on 13 with this discussion of domestic work. So according to Patricia Hill Collins, she wants to argue that black women have a very specific relationship within US forms of inequality that give them an insight into how inequality works. And so we're going to kind of try to understand where that's coming from. So on page 13, that bottom paragraph, you guys want to look that over. What's unique about black women's experience? Well, I think we could probably extend this particularly to foreign-born Hispanic women as well. That was not a sickness cough. That was a piece of peanut caught in my throat. Just so you know.
Well, so like they worked for like white families, and they were kind of like nannies, like, sort of like nannies. So like they were able to see like how like the white like privileged families, like how they were like, I don't know, like they just like could see them in like a really like, I don't know, just like they could see them really like well and kind of see how they like interacted and stuff, and they were like, they basically like raised like their children sort of, so.
Yeah, so there's like this weird position that poor minority women find themselves in often, where they are literally inside the homes of the wealthiest white people taking care of them. And yet they're not, they're like part of the family, like people talk about them in enduring terms often, right, et cetera, but they're also not. So they're excluded, but they're within. So they get to, they see in a lot of ways multiple perspectives within that, right? This is tied to something, has anyone ever heard of Hegel? George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Maybe the most important philosopher in the last 200 years. It's either him or Immanuel Kant. almost all modern philosophy grows out of either Hegel or Kant. But anyways, Hegel has this thing, it's not just it's called the master-slave dialectic. And at some point we're going to have to probably get into what dialectic means, but I'm not going to do that yet. Because she likes to use this word too a lot, right? In fact, like most people who are influenced at all by Marxism or something like that love to use the word dialectic. Okay, so the master-slave dialectic is the idea of like, who do we normally think of as being, I guess, having a better understanding of the world? A master or a slave? We would assume the master, right? Because the master is in charge, right? Why, you know, he has access to information. He has access to, you know, going out and getting an education, et cetera, right? Through his privilege, the master, we would assume, would have a better understanding of the world. Hegel wants to claim that this is not true, that actually the slave understands the world better. And the reason why, and this is old, so if you wonder why it has this language to it, right, master-slave, it's because there were actually masters and slaves when Hegel was writing. So, so anyways, so for Hegel, he's writing in the early 1800s. So for Hegel, what he's trying to claim is what he uses as basis of that is who has to understand who. So who has to understand who in terms of the relationship between a master and a slave? Who has to be able to think like the other person?
The slave.
The slave. So later on we're going to see something called double consciousness. It's used a little bit differently by somebody named W.B. Du Bois. There's a whole discussion of that in the Gilmore text later. Which is also grows out of the same idea. Essentially what he says is that slaves therefore have what he refers to as double consciousness. They're capable of thinking both in terms of the master they serve and themselves as a human being all at once, something the master is entirely clueless of. Like the master, it's just all about what he wants, right? So the master thinks in terms of his needs, his desires, you know, et cetera, and never has to put himself in the position of the slave. The slave always has to put himself in the position of the master and himself all at once, right? How do we see something similar being done here by Patricia Hill Collins? What's the similarity here between black women in the United States and Hegel's master-slave dialectic?
I think she's kind of saying that like black women have had a more understanding of what's going on because they see it from their perspective, and I guess I don't want to say they're more open, but they kind of have to be because they're just being forced to believe it, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, so the argument is kind of like black women are placed in a position of having to see things from a lot of different perspectives all at once, right? And they're capable of seeing, like, they understand the white world better than most minorities, right? Because they literally live in white people, often spend more time in white people's houses as domestic servants than actual, right? And that's what she's claiming at least, right? Yeah, at least historically that's been true, right? And that they have to interact at the same time as an outsider within in terms of their own families, right? Where they have less power, right? Within their own communities where they have less power, right? So getting back to the voices that she's interested in. So throughout Patricia Hill Collins' work, she's streaming together these black women's voices from throughout history. Why would she do that? What's the significance of that as a project? And you see this popping up throughout this entire first two chapters, right? She's always pulling back to throughout the history of black women from the, you know, the 19th century onward, these voices. Why is she pulling these obscure voices? What would be the purpose of that? Why would you want to do that within this worldview?
Because she wants to make this known that like this isn't something that's just happening now, it's like been going on for a while. How it's like different accounts or different situations.
I think there's something deeper being said here. So yes, it is, there's a historical continuity to oppression. But we get that in like anything written about oppression, right? You're gonna find that there's a pretty strong historical continuity to it, but.
Almost that like they understand like the world better, or like a different like perspective that like we haven't heard before.
Yeah, it's that they're understanding the world better, so there's a reason to go and trace out what you can find, right? Another way to put it is the voices we hear the most are the most ignorant, usually. That's the claim here. That's the claim of something in general called standpoint epistemologies. That the voices we often hear are the voices of the people who understand the world the least. Because what gives you access to having your voice heard? What determines if somebody is capable of, for the most part, writing down their words, having people learn them? What makes it possible to be the person who speaks to large groups of people? What makes it possible to essentially have an influence?
Power and wealth.
It's just power, right? Yeah, so if you think that more powerful people don't understand their world because they're capable of being more selfish, right? And they are, right? Like, what power means is that you get to force other people to do what you want. So almost by definition, if you're looking at the world through Hegel's master-slave dialectic, right? Almost by definition, having your voice heard probably means that you understand people less because you're capable of being more selfish. Does that make sense? So that's why there's sort of this project to sort of like go through and find all these voices and figure out what they're saying. Okay, all that makes sense so far? Questions or thoughts so far on Patricia Hill Collins? I like taking long pauses because sometimes people need time to process. Right? So, okay. Anybody catch what Patricia Hill Collins' critique of feminism is? We kind of nodded at this. This is one of the this is maybe one of the more controversial things about Patricia Hill Collins is her critique of feminism. How familiar are you guys with feminism? What do you know about feminism? Massive branch of thought.
Well, it's like men and women should be treated equally.
What's that?
It's like men and women should be treated equally, and we should have like the same, same rights.
Yeah, so that would be a branch of feminism called liberal feminism usually, right? Where you're focused on things like, this was the early like suffrage movement in women, the right to vote, things like that, right? The ability to, own property, right? Women until the 20th century weren't allowed to own property, in the United States, things like that. What else is included kind of under feminism? What else do you know about feminist thought?
The way that women are treated socially, like by men, especially today, we're talking more about harassment and like workplace stuff, but that's not really like laws that are different, like for the genders, but they're things that like ways women are treated differently.
Yeah. So there's a lot of like focus on, this is a branch of feminism referred to as victim feminism, right? which is like, focuses on the way that women are victimized, right? In particular, things like sexual assault, things like that. What else do we know about feminist law? There's another thing that gets brought up a lot. And it gets brought up a lot in this text. Before the 1960s, I'd say, what did women generally not have access to? They have by the 1960s, women have the right to vote, they have the right to own property. What do women generally not have access to? In particular, white women. We're going to see the significance of this. This is like a major branch of feminism. This is maybe the biggest push of second wave feminism. They don't have the right to work. Women don't have access to work, right? They don't have access to their own ways of making money usually, right? What does that? What kind of relationship does that create for women to their families, particularly their husbands?
They're like dependent on their husband.
Yeah, it makes women unilaterally dependent upon their husbands, right? Which creates a really strong unequalness within the family, right? And that's kind of the focus of second wave feminism law. This is the thing that Patricia Hill Collins pushes back against the most in terms of, this is something called the separate spheres argument usually, right? Where like men and women live in separate spheres, women live within the home sphere, men live within the greater sphere, and that determines, right, this interrelationship between men and women. So why would, and this is also like, did anybody catch this quote from Sojourner Truth, this "ain't I a woman" thing? This is a very famous quote from her, partially I think because of Patricia Hill Collins. It's towards the end of the first chapter. This is on page 17. Let me pick up on this. So even though that becomes a big thing in the 1960s and 70s, it has deeper roots in the 19th century, particularly in this idea of women being forced into being weak. Has anybody ever heard of the story by Patricia Gilman, The Yellow Wallpaper? Ever heard of this story? It's like part of the feminist canon. It's basically the story of this woman that her husband convinces her that she's crazy, and then she slowly loses her mind by being locked inside of this room all day. That's what the story's about, right? So, even in the 18th century, there's this idea of like women are forced into being weak, subservient people, right, who stay at home, that don't take part in anything. They're thought of as being less intelligent than men, and in some ways forced into roles that actually make that true, is the claim, right, by a lot of white feminists. So Sojourner Truth is an African-American woman, and she takes some qualm to what feminists push for. She's a feminist in the 19th century, and this quote, does anybody want to read the quote aloud? Page 17, bottom of the page. You don't need to be so passive in this class. You can talk. It's okay. I'm going to wait for a volunteer. Go ahead.
That man over there says women need to be helped in the carriages and lifted over ditches and have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me in the carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me, look at my arm. I've plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could heed me. And I ain't a woman. I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And I ain't a woman. I have borne 13 children, and most of them all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. Ain't I a woman?
So how is this relating to feminist discussions of women? What's Patricia Hill, what is Patricia Hill Collins pointing to here about feminism and what feminism isn't addressing? Whose position is it that? Who gets to stay at home and not enter into work out of women?
A white woman.
White women. All white women? What's that?
Yes.
Other class that women.
Yeah, so feminine, like Patricia Hill Collins is like, for the most part, if you follow what feminism pushes for, it mainly has pushed for things that only help upper to middle class white women. That's the claim, right? And why is that? Like, if you think about fighting for the right to work, what's the irony of that if you're a black woman in the turn of the century? Or before?
You've been working.
You've been working your whole life. What do you probably want to do?
Not work.
You probably don't want to work. And what do you probably want to do instead? Whose children do you get to raise in that society in the early 20th century if you're a black woman?
The white woman's family.
You get to raise some white woman's kids. So like there's this weird thing of talking about being suppressed by the domestic, right? And this is often a very common thing for black feminists, right? When in reality, like a lot of African American women would like to spend more time with their children. And I think this is still true today because what do most poor people do with their time? Particularly working poor people. This is a big mythos in America. Who works the most?
Middle class.
What's that?
Middle class.
Moms.
What's that?
Moms.
Yeah, well, yeah, moms work the most. Like, actually, like that's very true. Domestic women often do work a lot of hours. You think about how much they're on, et cetera, et cetera. The working poor works the most hours. Why is that?
They often have to have more than one job just to live.
Yeah, most people have multiple jobs just to scrape by, right? Like, and that's a good chunk of the United States population, right? So, like, there's a certain irony of saying to somebody that has all these multiple jobs who would like to spend more time with their family, that their family is the thing that suppresses them, right? When in reality it's not, it's their labor, right? And so like essentially Patricia Hill Collins' claim about white feminism is that like it's not that it's bad that white women fight for, you know, access to good paying jobs. Right, that's not her point. But her point is that doesn't necessarily help everybody who is a woman. So treating women, right, and this gets back to intersectionality, treating women as a unilateral category where everybody has the same interest within the category of being women will unilaterally, in some ways, hurt certain subsets of the female population, particularly in this case, black women, right? So it doesn't do anything to help them, but why does it hurt them? What's our perception sometimes about women's equality now? We get this sometimes about racial equality too. What are a lot of people's perceptions of equality between the genders? I was listening to NPR on the way over here this morning. I'm not trying to like oust myself politically by saying I listened to NPR. But I was listening to NPR and they were doing coverage of the Black Lives Matter. And they were recording the counter-protesters. And what the counter-protesters were saying to the camera is that we live in a society where nobody cares about race and nobody cares about gender anymore. So like, why do people protest? Like, this isn't really an issue. You're just scaring my children was the claim I think the person actually made. I think this actually is a lot of people's attitudes in the United States. A lot of people's attitudes that we live inside of a post-racial, post-gender society where everything is equal. And it's not really true, but it gets increasingly not true when you start sparsing people out by groups. right? So like we have less and less equality for people who hit more points on the intersectionalities, you know, that are touching more points of domination on that matrix, right? And that's kind of her point is that in some ways, like, as only certain like privileged subsets of the African American community or women or right, et cetera, make gains, there actually is a feeling that the entire group made gains, so we don't really need to talk about it anymore, which isn't really actually true. So here you get, for her critique of feminism, is that feminism did make great strides for wealthy white women, leaving everybody behind and creating this feeling that black women somehow are more advantaged than they used to be, right? Which doesn't really, like, in some ways, like, curtails, right, any future change. That's kind of her claim. Make sense? Okay, cool. Any thoughts or questions about that? Critique of feminism. We're going to see her critique feminism more, I'm sure. She's very known as a critic of white feminism. Which makes, Patricia Hill Collins is a feminist, right? She's a third wave feminist, so. Anything else?
Yeah, really quick. So if you were going to say that feminism only helps a certain segment of women,
Yeah.
then you make the same argument that the Black Lives Matter movement only helps a certain segment of Black lives.
I mean, that would be, I think with Black Lives Matter, that Patricia Hill Collins would probably want to claim that, like, that movement actually, at the very least, is more geared towards lower class African Americans' experiences, right? So in particular, you think about, like, what's the issue with the Black Lives Matter movement? What's the central issue being played out here? What are people protesting?
Police brutality.
Police brutality, right? That disproportionately affects more vulnerable black populations. We compare this to, like, affirmative action in the 90s, right? Affirmative action. Does anybody know who benefited from affirmative action policies mostly? Middle class African Americans, right? There's this whole literature, W.J. Wilson is a major figure on this. He wrote a book called The Truly Disadvantaged in the 90s during the heyday of that argument. And essentially his claim was that what you actually saw was a middle class flight out of African American neighborhoods as a result of affirmative action, which actually made the ghetto worse, you know. So like that's kind of like, if you juxtapose that to the Black Lives Matter movement, I think you see that, like, now it's more focusing on issues that are immediately problematic for poorer black people, you know. And so, like, I think that you could read it as possibly, like, I don't know how we want to weave women's experiences into that, and how that's relating to it, but also, like, a lot of the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement are actually black women. I'm not sure if you guys have noticed that. A lot of, especially the more local, like, you know, individual people who are leading protests are often black women. So, so I don't know. You know, unfortunately, as an academic, you're usually set thinking about things in hindsight. You know, after they happen, and what didn't work. Yeah. Other questions? That was a good question. We're going to have some readings on Black Lives Matter coming up later, so we'll move towards that. Definitely feel like it's something you need to talk in a contemporary race and ethnicity class. I'm not pushing anybody towards having any set opinions, right? Like, I'm okay with alternative voices. I want to remind people of that. So, like, I feel, you know, I talk if no one else does. You know, but that doesn't mean that I actually hate the sound of my own voice and greatly dislike it. The videos drive me nuts, because, like, I have to, like, listen to my own voice to cut out all the times I forget to shut it off, and it's just like 20 minutes of me cleaning the classroom. Afterwards, like, mumbling to myself about what I have to do next, you know? It's like, anyways, hate the sound of my own voice, don't really want to talk all the time, so I'm like, please leave it with opinions. Okay. Any other reactions? So there's one last thing that we should point out about Patricia Hill Collins, and that's that how does black women, the black women that she studies, differ from most of the stuff that you would talk about in terms of scholarship? Right? Most of the things that you're going to read that are going to be explanations of things. And this is particularly comes out in that second chapter. Another way to put it is, what is the relationship of black women thinkers to political action and experience? Anybody pick up on this? Right at the onset of that second chapter, she starts, going back to like, there's going to be a lot of like interaction with white feminism in this book. But they're critiquing like discussions about how do you define womanhood. And black feminists are a little bit like, what's their reaction to that? What's Patricia Hill Collins' reaction to this? Sort of like, let's define what this means or what that means kind of mentality towards inequality. Let's make sure we have the right definitions in play kind of attitude. Political correctness, if we really believe. There's Patricia Hill Collins' feelings about political correctness. For the very first sentence, what does she call it? U.S. black women's struggles on this linguistic treadmill. Is that a flattering way of describing the discussion of political correctness? No, what's the image here? What do we talk about a lot when we talk about inequality, according to Patricia Hill Collins? Words. We spend more time debating about the meaning of words than we do actually doing them. Right? And so Patricia Hill Collins wants to be like, regular academic discourse hampers, right, our ability to act. Right? So she wants to claim that black feminism is different from other branches of discussions of inequality because it doesn't really try to get on that treadmill, doesn't try to spend most of its time redefining its own terms, right? You guys have spent enough time in college to realize how important definitions are within college, right? Like most of your classes, like you get a textbook, and what do you get? It's just a string of definitions. That's all it is. It's just a string of definitions pasted together for an entire chapter, right? Like most of your classes are essentially just language classes where you learn terms, right? And these terms are constantly changing and people are constantly debating about them, right? She wants to claim that in not being connected to sort of academic scholarly discourse, black women's voices, who she calls black women scholars, right? Even though no one would call somebody usually who was born a slave, who didn't hold a degree, who never got a high school education, who maybe couldn't even read and write a scholar. But she wants to claim that that is, right? Because if they're actively thinking about their position in the world, right, they're scholars. But it's an everyday form of scholarship, right? And it's particularly tied to practice. So it's tied to their experiences of oppression, leading them into forms of political action. So thinking about this is, so for Patricia Hill Collins, political action and everyday experience is really central. I'm just going to point that out for now, right? And we're going to see how that plays back into the narrative again as we move forward. Okay, I want us to talk about our projects in the last 20 minutes we have left. So unless people have any more questions, we will get back to Patricia Hill Collins plenty of times because it's a monograph. They take longer to read. Now, granted, in grad school you would get this assigned in 1 week, and you just have to read the whole thing in 1 week. But I feel like there's a lot for you guys, I'm assuming, right? So I try to sparse it up, which means you also have to talk about it more. I would usually probably, if I was like working on a project, probably read this book in 3 days. But once again, that's with lots of years of experience on, you get faster at it the more you do it, so. Okay, so let's go ahead and think about, like, does everyone have an idea of what they're kind of thinking about doing for their projects? We can skip over people and come back, but for those of you, right, because it's due this week, so, but I think like it might be nice for us to start talking about it and thinking about it, so. Do you have an idea of what you want to do yet, Deontay? Can we kick it off with you and then move down the rows?
I kind of wanted to do like police brutality, I guess, against minorities, and like when they're getting arrested, and white people when they're getting arrested, and if they were both unarmed or armed.
Okay.
In that situation.
Yeah.
So that's what I wanted to do.
I think there's a lot of interesting comparisons that can be made. Anybody, any thoughts from any of you guys? Ways of narrowing or focusing within that? I'm wondering too, like thinking about like all the protest movements that are happening and police action, because we've got a lot of police violence against protesters. I think you could do like a really interesting comparison of, did anybody hear about the Michigan thing? So this was around mask stuff. A bunch of like, and this wasn't a racial protest, right? But there was a lot of people who, and they were all white, who were opposed to the wearing of masks in the shelter at home order, and they all carried AK-47s and AR-15s into the Capitol building in protest. And they didn't do anything about it. Yet you have unarmed, so thinking about this armed, unarmed thing, right? And yet you have like unarmed African Americans, and we regularly get reporting on them as if they're like, you know, like this horribly violent thing happening, right? And I think that this really interesting dichotomy to like, carrying assault rifles isn't violent, right? And also like counter-protesters have been, to the Black Lives Matter movement, have actually been bringing assault rifles. And even recently we had somebody shoot some people. You know, so I think like maybe like, and the cops didn't stop him. When he was walking back, the cops are having a conversation. He's just like walking around with his AR-15, right? Like, I think there's an interesting dichotomy there. Thinking about armed versus unarmed. I'm not saying you should do that, but I just like, what's popped into my head. Any other thoughts or reactions to Deontay's topic? You guys are a quiet group. I know I keep on saying that. Don't be so shy. Seriously, I'm not that intimidating.
So I was thinking about doing like the Black Lives Matter movement, and like I don't know, I was kind of like, I'm kind of having a hard time like figuring out like what I want to do like on that, but I don't know, I was thinking about it'd be kind of cool to like look at kind of like the history, even though it's like a really like new movement, it'd be kind of cool to like look and like see like, oh, like what started it, and like kind of like the cases of like, you know, like the police brutality, and be like, oh, what was this case about, and stuff like that. So I don't know, I'm trying to figure out like if that's going to be like enough information that I can like actually put it into like 12 pages, but.
Yeah, well, actually, like it's older than you'd think. Is anybody aware when it started?
2014.
Yeah. 6 years ago is quite a while, right? Like, 'cause it was Trayvon Martin, right? Isn't that who? Yeah, who got shot in a Florida suburb. I think it was in Florida. You know, so I think there's actually like quite a few cases. So you could probably do a sort of. I'd like to see you dig in a bit more, as in like do some analysis on them, maybe. You know what I mean? Like rather than just report back what happened. Like what's the meaning of it? Everything. Other thoughts about what you could do if you're doing a history of, and people want to work together, I'm okay with that too. But so if we get some topics that are real similar. Thoughts or reactions to the history of Black Lives Matter?
Maybe what the general population's reaction has been to Black Lives Matter over time, and like the way that it's reported on, if it's changed at all.
I feel. What do people feel about whether it's changed? What do you think?
think people know about it more than what they did back then.
Yeah, people are probably more aware of it.
It's garnered more support like now than it did before. Or at least like you hear about more people like talking about it, I guess. That's what I see.
Well, yeah, it's definitely gotten bigger too. Any other feelings of how it's changed, particularly people's reactions? I think it's probably gotten more polarized too. Like, I think that there's a lot more hostility towards Black Lives Matter as it grows, than when it was in 2014. 'Cause like and I don't mean this because like it's going back to like don't take this as like a political statement, right? But like when I was in graduate school, a bunch of us went to the Black Lives Matter rally for Trayvon Martin in Richmond, Virginia. Or no, that was Knoxville, Tennessee. But at that time, it was like nobody, like there was no counter protest. There was nothing like really like very like tense about it at all. It was just like people just being like, yeah, I support, thinking actively more about like how we think and treat Black people. Like that's so good, and people were just showing up. There was no counter protest. There was no fear surrounding it. It was just kind of like, and it almost felt, and I'm not gonna say innocuous because that sounds mean to call a political activist group innocuous, but it felt like there was, if anything, it felt like people were just vaguely supportive, but not really doing much, Yeah, I think those are really interesting ways of approaching it. Other people? What do you think about that?
I was gonna look at like modern genocide and how it's been like reported like across, like how it's being reported differently in like Europe in comparison to like America, or how we see it differently.
Interesting. Any particular genocides you have in mind?
No, not yet. I would have to do more research over that.
Unfortunately, there are a lot of genocides. So, yeah. I wonder too, like, thinking about that, like, sorry, I'm dominating by accident. Thoughts and reactions about the genocide study?
So I took Modern Asian Survey last semester, and they were talking about how in China currently there is a huge suppression of the Uyghur population. So they're a minority that are just being essentially put into concentration camps and just killed out. And even with that, like, we're not getting any reportings on it.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd heard of the Uyghur thing too. There's one a couple of years ago in Thailand too, both of which were against Muslims. The Uyghurs are Muslims, mostly. Any other thoughts? I also wonder, like, where it happens would be an interesting question to think about too, like, tied to that, not like, so like, not only like, where do you get your reporting from, but like, because I feel like we really do treat like genocides that happen in a place like Europe very differently from we treat something in Southeast Asia or Africa. And there's a lot of like implicit racism to that that's kind of interesting, right? Like, there's almost an assumption that Asians and people of African descent will just commit genocide against each other, but like, we do it in America and it's like never again, right? Or not in America, but we do it in Europe and it's like never again. I always feel that way when I go to like Holocaust museums. There's all these statements that, the world will never let a genocide happen again. And it's probably been like 60 genocides since then, and nobody has, for the most part, America has never intervened in a genocide that's happened other than in Europe. Like, and why is that, right? Like, why is it that the African Union has to like intervene as opposed to like NATO, right? Like, I think this is an interesting question. So like, I think not thinking about reporting, there's also like an interesting question about like where it is and if that changes that reporting. Because I think you'd probably see that bias also in like European news sources as well. Other thoughts about genocide?
I was going to look at how, just how we've seen African American clergy in the Catholic they've come to like run parishes and like become these places of authority during times where like obviously even in the church itself there is some like racist undertones.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. I feel like too, like, if you think about hierarchy, we get like people from other, that would be considered like from poorer countries, right? That would have historically had a racial bias against it, like getting fairly high up in the Catholic Church, like almost being elected pope, even, you know? And I think, you know, that's sort of, yeah, that's an interesting topic. I'd be interested to see what you come up with, because it's not an area I would have automatically thought of in recent cities. It'll be interesting. What other thoughts about that? I should keep on doing this. This isn't just advice from Nick Hour. Like, thoughts about, did people hear his well enough? What do you guys think about I guess, like, positions of clergy and how it might be changing in the Catholic Church, or, you know, even historically, right? How in even times before. Catholic Church has a very interesting history, like multifaceted history with a lot of the stuff that we're studying, particularly colonialism, you know, at moments being very much so the advocates of different disenfranchised people, and at other moments, you know, actually like very much so hurting indigenous populations. Pretty fascinating stuff.
I don't really know. Maybe like about immigration.
Okay.
Like over immigration, like ICE and all that. I don't know exactly what, but
Well, I didn't hear the last part of that.
like ICE, like how they like immigration people take them.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know what I want to like focus on.
Within that.
Yeah.
There's a huge amount of stuff now on that. And one thing, if you feel like you have something that's too broad, like when you go to collect literature on it, like that might help you narrow into something else too.
I was thinking, again, a little bit broad, but just kind of like the different cultural differences that kind of link into like the choices, maybe like on crime or things like that, like race. Yeah, just I don't know, something I'd like research a little bit more, but just kind of that's a broad idea.
Yeah. Like cultural attitudes towards
Yeah.
crime. Thoughts about that? We got quite a few criminologists in the room. How do you guys feel about cultural attitudes about crime between different racial groups? What could be looked into? What kind of crime?
I haven't decided yet.
No, but like you probably have some, you know, usually when we talk in abstraction, we actually have something concrete in mind.
I was haven't really researched it a lot, but maybe not just the more like youth crimes, maybe not murder and things like that, but just kind of how maybe like different, maybe even like geographically, like how that affects just kind of like life choices and kind of.
Yeah. So like you're thinking like things like what, like truancy
Yeah.
and vandalism.
Yeah, maybe things like that.
Yeah. Interesting. I think there's also like one thing whenever you're talking about race and crime, there's an interesting feedback loop you have to think about, which is that we often make the behaviors of African Americans illegal.
Mm-hmm.
So like it works in both directions, right? So like things that African Americans do is more likely to be made illegal, and then or at least have harsher punishments attached to it than the things that white young people would do. So like, is it that their cultural attitude is different, or is it that their cultural attitude was different and then it became criminalized, right? So this is kind of a chicken and the egg thing that gets really important. And you see that particularly, usually you see that mostly around the drug literature. But I wonder if there is something like that in truancy. What's that?
So maybe like discrepancy in like arrest rates or like sentences would also be something to look into.
Yeah, well, but back to like, what causes the discrepancy? Like, is it different behaviors that are, like, is it that the law is different, or is it that, right? And that's just something that you're gonna have to like deal with, is the causality of it. That's not a problem, right?
Mhm.
Just something you should actively think about.
Okay.
Anyone else on youth crimes?
And something else you could look into is like the family history, whether or not they come from like broken families or a good family or a wealthy or poor family, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And even get some intersectionality in there too, yeah. Poverty stuff is always hard in crime stuff because we don't collect statistics on it. So we often don't know how wealthy people, like there's no actual like literature on whether poor people commit more crimes. And it's actually like really debatable whether they do. You know, so like there's also something really weird about that too when you get into like a lot of crime stuff. A lot of times actually they will just use race as a proxy for the people who are in my, I apologize for repeating myself if you're in my research design class. Anyways, but like they actually will often use it as a proxy. Which going back to like, there's something really kind of weird about that. This is a strange acknowledgement of African Americans being disenfranchised by the sheer fact that we can use it as a proxy variable for poverty. Okay, go ahead. Laura. Your turn.
I'm not really sure yet. I'm still trying to decide.
You want to talk Tuesday?
Hmm?
Oh, you want to share on Tuesday, because we're gonna round up
Yeah,
after this
yeah.
next one. So.
I'm thinking of doing something like our attitude, especially in the U.S. towards the Middle East and different people there, just like the way that we perceive them. I'm thinking of kind of honing in on maybe Vietnam and the war there.
Okay.
But just how we often see them as just third world countries, and that's a way to dismiss it pretty easily, dismiss humanity.
Yeah. Does anybody know how like Europeans have a tendency to think of Vietnam now? It's kind of like a cool resort place to go. Which is, I think, probably very different than our perceptions here, like thinking about that, right? Like I think there's probably like, if I was just to be like, yeah, I'm gonna go to Vietnam for a week and go like, you know, hang out on the beach.
That's actually kind of where
Drink
the idea
specialty
came
drinks.
from.
Is that where the idea came from?
Yeah, because I was just like, I love travel, and I was just kind of like researching different places I wanted to go, and like Vietnam's gorgeous. But like every time I was like, I think I have a cool place to go, people are like, what? Why would you want to go there? Like you're gonna die. I'm like, I mean.
When I applied for this job, I was actually applying all over the world, and one of the schools I applied to was the American University in Vietnam. American University runs, you know, colleges all over the world. But anyways, when I would bring that up to people, people would be like, why would you move there? Like, you're gonna die in Vietnam. And it's like, no, like, it's like a European resort. Like, the beach area is like really nice. And it's actually like one of the safest cities in Southeast Asia. I'm trying to think of the capital. I'm blanking on it. We all say it. Like, so there's the famous Saigon. Anyways, gotta clean up, so I'm gonna let you guys go. We'll pick up talking about them on Tuesday. Brainstorming our projects.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me get that out of the way.